Today we're going to be doing part 2 of what we began last week, talking about the peaks and the valleys of the last days of the southern kingdom. And last week we talked about Hezekiah, and he was compared to David. He was one of the best kings that the southern kingdom ever had. He led an enormous revival, had a Passover celebration that was unlike anything that they had had since the days of Solomon, destroyed idolatry wherever he found it. And his son, Manasseh, was one of the worst kings that the southern kingdom ever had. And we're going to learn about him in 2 Kings chapter 21. We get a little hint at the end of Hezekiah's life when he's told that the Babylonian captivity won't happen in his lifetime, but in the days of his descendants. He says, "It is good if there will be peace and truth in my days." And I don't want to read too much into that one little statement, but from that, in combination with the kind of man Manasseh turned out to be, it's very possible that Hezekiah had some of the same failing that David himself did in regard to his children, in regard to passing on the faith. And I remember as a child in my family's Bible studies that we did together, the greatest lesson that I took away from that time was the fact that David's children didn't follow in his footsteps, that he was a great man in so many ways, but he failed in that one area. And as a child, that made me want to follow my parents in faith, and it made me want to pass that faith on to my children as well. It instilled in me at the very young age that I was that what we have can be easily lost between generations, that children very often go a different direction from their parents, and that's something we see, of course, throughout the book of Kings. Manasseh, at the beginning of 2 Kings 21, was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Hephzibah. Now, Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king. How many years were ended to or added to Hezekiah's life after his illness? Who remembers? 15. So Manasseh, unless he started reigning during his father's lifetime, if there's something like that going on, probably Manasseh was born after that sickness. And if he was Hezekiah's oldest son, that might help explain his prayer and the passion with which he begged God to preserve his life if he hadn't had children by that point. But it could also mean that he had another more qualified son that didn't reign. I don't know. We don't know the whole story. We're not given the details. It's just interesting that Manasseh was 12 years old, that he was born during that time that Hezekiah asked for, that God wasn't originally going to give him. That was verse 1. Verse 2 describes his reign, and he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, according to the abominations of the nations whom Yahweh dispossessed before the sons of Israel. Indeed, he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed, and he erected altars for Baal, and made an Asherah, as Ahab king of Israel had done, and worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. And he built altars in the house of Yahweh, of which Yahweh had said, in Jerusalem I will put my name. But he did one worse than Ahaz. Ahaz had shut the temple and made altars throughout the streets of Jerusalem. Manasseh put pagan altars. He built shrines in the temple itself to other gods. Indeed, he built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of Yahweh. He even made his son pass through the fire, as Ahaz had done, practiced soothsaying and interpreted omens, and dealt with mediums and spiritists, all the same things as his grandfather. He did much that was evil in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him to anger. Then he put the graven image of Asherah, which he had made, in the house which Yahweh had said to David and to Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. And I will not make the foot of Israel wander any more from the land which I gave their fathers, if only they will be careful to do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. But they did not listen, and Manasseh led them astray in order to do more evil than the nations whom Yahweh destroyed before the sons of Israel. So the writer of Kings, as we've noticed before, one of the big reasons he's writing, the point that he's trying to make through his interpretation of their history, is that God was just in exiling them. That it was because of their unfaithfulness, the fact that they had broken the covenant that they had with God. Because we see in the days of Jeremiah, people were saying God would never allow this to happen. It was a common idea that God would protect his people no matter what. And the writer of Kings wants them to understand this is in line with the promises God made. God promised that he would be with us, that he would keep us in this land if we kept his covenant. It was a conditional thing, and we failed. Verse 10, then Yahweh spoke by the hand of his slaves the prophets, saying, because Manasseh, king of Judah, has done these abominations. Manasseh, king of Judah, has done all these abominations. He has done more evil than all the Amorites did who were before him, and has also made Judah sin with his idols. Therefore, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, behold, I am bringing such calamity on Jerusalem and Judah, that whoever hears of it, both his ears will tingle. And I will stretch over Jerusalem the line of Samaria, and the level of the house of Ahab, and I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish. He wipes it and turns it upside down. So Samaria had already gone into exile at this point. The northern kingdom was already destroyed. And the house of Ahab, being the worst house that ever ruled in the northern kingdom, is representative of their whole kingdom and their way of life. The same judgment with which he judged them, he will bring against Jerusalem. He will wipe them clean, turn them upside down like you do a clean dish. He will remove them because they have done what is evil in my sight. Verse 15. And have been provoking me to anger since the days their fathers came out of Egypt, even to this day. So this is the result of more than just the current situation. This is their whole tendency toward idolatry that God is dealing with here. Moreover, Manasseh shed much innocent blood until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another. Besides his sin with which he made Judah sin in doing what is evil in the sight of Yahweh. So he was both an idolater and he was a cruel king, an oppressive king, most likely to those who spoke against him and what he was doing. And something that we don't get in 2 Kings, because again, the writer of 2 Kings is making a point here. Manasseh's reign was absolutely a reign that moved the nation closer to judgment. And overall, he was a bad king, and that's what's being emphasized here. But there's another half of Manasseh's story that we see in 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles 33. And the first 9 verses of 2 Chronicles 33 say basically the same thing that we already read in Kings. And verse 10 says, "Then Yahweh spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they paid no attention. Therefore, Yahweh brought the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria against him. And they captured Manasseh with hooks, bound him with bronze chains, and took him to Babylon." With hooks means that he had a hook put through his nose as a way to lead him disgracefully as a prisoner, and took him to Babylon. And when he was in distress, he entreated Yahweh his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He recognized that this had happened to him because he had abandoned God and gone after other gods. He had enough background from his father, enough understanding of the history of his nation to recognize this. And he prayed to him. And God was moved by his entreaty and heard his supplication and returned him back to Jerusalem, to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that Yahweh was God. Afterwards, he built the outer city wall, the outer wall of the city of David on the west side of Gihon, in the valley, even to the entrance of the fish gate. And he encircled the Ophel with it, and made it very high. Then he put military commanders in all the fortified cities of Judah. He also removed the foreign gods and the idol from the house of Yahweh, as well as the altars which he had built on the mountain of the house of Yahweh and in Jerusalem, and he threw them outside the city. Then he set up the altar of Yahweh and sacrificed peace offerings and thank offerings on it. And he said for Judah to serve Yahweh, the God of Israel. Nevertheless, the people still sacrificed in the high places, although only to Yahweh their God. Now the rest of the acts of Manasseh, even his prayer to his God, and the words of the seers who spoke to him in the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel, behold, they are among the chronicles of the kings of Israel. His prayer also, and how God was entreated by him, and all his sin, his unfaithfulness, and the sites on which he built high places and erected Asherim and the graven images before he humbled himself. Behold, they are written in the chronicles of the Hosea. Which my note says in Greek is seers. The chronicles of the seers, which I don't know if that's just, that might just be in the Septuagint then, the Greek translation. And Manasseh slept with his fathers, and they buried him in his own house. And Amon, his son, became king in his place. So, just some review. Uzziah, the one who died in the year that Isaiah had his great vision. Uzziah was the one who went into the temple. He was proud. of his spirituality. He offered incense before God when he shouldn't have. He was overall a good king. And Jotham, his son, followed in his footsteps. He learned from his father's mistake. He was a good king as well, but had a very short reign. And then from there we went to Ahaz, who of course was a very bad king and never repented of it. Then to Hezekiah, who was one of the best kings and only failed a little toward the end of his life, not nearly as badly as a lot of other good kings did. Then to Manasseh, who was horrible and then repented later in life, told everybody to stop worshiping idols. Then we have Ammon. And Ammon was 22 years old when he became king in 2 Chronicles 33, verse 21. And he reigned 2 years in Jerusalem, so another very short reign. And he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, as Manasseh his father had done. And Ammon sacrificed to all the graven images which his father Manasseh had made, and served them. Moreover, he did not humble himself before Yahweh as his father Manasseh had humbled himself, but Ammon multiplied guilt. So compare Ammon to Jotham. Jotham did everything good that his father did except for the one bad thing. Ammon did everything bad his father did, except he didn't repent. Yeah.
More than as
Manasseh is one of the names of the tribes of Israel as well. Yep, that's why it's familiar. Ephraim and Manasseh. Mephibosheth was that one. Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember if there's anyone else. Yeah, that was Mephibosheth. Mm-hmm. Yep, so Ammon was a very brief reign, but did a lot of bad, did a lot to undo his father's reform near the end of his life. Then his servants conspired against him and put him to death in his own house. Then the people of the land struck down all those who had conspired against King Ammon, and the people of the land made Josiah, his son, king in his place. And we know a lot more about Josiah. He accomplished a lot more in his reign than Ammon did in his short time on the throne. And Josiah was a good king as well. He reacted against his father Ammon. And something that I pointed out last time is just because of how far apart these kings become, you get the impression that in Israel there was a growing divide between those who followed God and those who followed idols. And based on which group the king aligned himself with, that's the direction they went. Those are the policies they followed. And so those who truly followed God had to become more distinct. Were sometimes persecuted, sometimes in power, but the light just kept getting lighter and the dark kept getting darker and stronger as the nation reached the end. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king. And he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. And he did what was right in the sight of Yahweh, and like Hezekiah, walked in the ways of his father David, and did not turn aside to the right or to the left. Now, in the 8th year of his reign, while he was still a youth, he began to seek the God of his father David. And in the 12th year, he began to cleanse Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the Asherim, the graven images, and the molten images. So it doesn't really give an indication that he was strong in faith, that he did anything as a kid when he first became king. His policies probably weren't determined by himself. He was very inexperienced, probably not qualified by that point to do much. But in the 8th year of his reign, so when he was 16, he really began to seek God. He really began to realize we prosper when we serve God. We need to serve God. God is God. He is real. We need to take this seriously, and I have a responsibility as king to lead the nation in the right direction. So he began to cleanse Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the Asherim, the graven images, and the molten images. In verse 4, they tore down the altars of the Baals in his presence, and the incense altars that were high above them he cut in pieces. Also the Asherim, the graven images, and the molten images he broke in pieces and ground to powder and scattered it on the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. Then he burned the bones of the priests on their altars and cleansed Judah and Jerusalem. And there's an irony there that he cleansed Judah and Jerusalem by defiling the pagan sites of worship, by making them unfit, even in the minds of the pagan element, for sacrifice beyond that point, because human bones had been burned on them. And in the cities of Manasseh, Ephraim, Simeon, even as far as Naphtali, in their surrounding ruins, he also tore down the altars and beat the Asherim and the graven images into powder, and cut in pieces all the incense altars throughout the land of Israel. Then he returned to Jerusalem. And it's a little bit unclear as to whether this is something that he did right now in his reign, or if it's talking about something he did later, early, just putting all of the relevant information together. This excursion into the northern kingdom, of course, there was no king in the northern kingdom to stop him at that point. And he went through the land and destroyed their idols and altars as well. And I say this may have happened later because we have an account of him doing this later in Kings as well. So either the chronology is being condensed somewhere, or he did this twice at different times. So he cared about the purity of the entire land, not just Judah. And he also cleansed and repaired the temple. In verse 8, in the 18th year of his reign, when he had cleansed the land and the house, he sent Shaphan, the son of Azaliah, and Maaseiah, an official of the city, and Joah, the son of Joahaz, the recorder, to repair the house of Yahweh his God. So he got around to this a little bit late in his reign, but he got there. And they came to Hilkiah, the high priest, and gave him the money that was brought into the house of God, which the Levites, the doorkeepers, had gathered from the hand of Manasseh and Ephraim, and from all the remnant of Israel, and from all Judah and Benjamin and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So they gathered money from the remnant of Israel as well as the citizens of Judah. There were a significant number of people apparently from the northern kingdom who had fled south. And this isn't the first time, we'll remember in Chronicles, we see this kind of migration south to Judah. And from these people, the Levites collected a tax to repair the temple. They gave it into the hand of those who did the work, who had the oversight of the house of Yahweh. And those who did the work, who were doing this in the house of Yahweh, used it to restore and repair the house. And as this was happening, this process of restoring the house of God, down in verse 14, when they were taking out the money which had been brought into the house of Yahweh, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of Yahweh given by the hand of Moses. So Hilkiah answered and said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of Yahweh. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan. Then Shaphan brought the book to the king, and furthermore responded to the king with a word, saying, everything that was given to the hand of your prophets, given to the hand of your servants, they are doing. They have also poured out the money. So this is just the report that the king got of the progress on the temple. Everything that you've given them to do, they're doing. They have also poured out the money that was found in the house of Yahweh and have given it into the hand of the supervisors and those who did the work. Moreover, Shaphan the scribe told the king, saying, hey, by the way, Hilkiah the priest gave me a book. And Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king. Now it happened that when the king heard the words of the law, he tore his clothes. Then the king commanded Hilkiah, Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, Abdon, the son of Micah, Shaphan the scribe, and Asaiah, the king's servant, saying, go, inquire of Yahweh for me, and those who are left in Israel and Judah, concerning the words of the book which has been found. For great is the wrath of Yahweh which is poured out against us, because our fathers have not kept the word of Yahweh to do according to all that is written in this book. So he realized that their sin went far beyond simply worshiping idols instead of God. He got that. That was clear to him very early on, but when this was read to him, he realized everything that they were supposed to be doing that was not part of the policies of the kingdom at all, that had been completely abandoned. And the fact that this was the only scroll that was found and that it had to be found gives us an indication that quite likely during either the time of King Ammon or the time of Manasseh earlier in his reign, the book of the law had been outlawed, that books had been destroyed. Because it was a common thing earlier. Jehoshaphat sent officials and Levites with books of the law throughout the land, teaching the people. But apparently it had been a while since it was in circulation. So Josiah tells them to go and inquire of the Lord concerning what is written in the book, what's going to happen to them because of their disobedience to do it, what they need to do now to make up for their sin as a nation. So Hilkiah and those whom the king had told went to Huldah the prophetess, the wife of Shallum the son of Tokath, the son of Hasra, keeper of the wardrobe. Now she lived in Jerusalem in the second quarter. And they spoke to her regarding this. And we've heard of prophetesses before. Isaiah's wife was a prophetess. Deborah spoke for God to the people. But this is a very rare thing, and it's interesting. This reference to Huldah that we have here. And when she speaks, of course, it is the word of God that she speaks, and she speaks with the same authority because of that, with which a male prophet would speak. She said to them, "Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, say to the man who sent you to me, thus says Yahweh, behold, I am bringing evil on this place and on its inhabitants, even all the curses written in the book, which they have read in the presence of the king of Judah." So this was almost certainly, is either the whole first 5 books of the Bible, or specifically the sermon part of Deuteronomy that was recorded. That's very likely what it was. The curses, the blessings and the curses are listed. This is what you will experience if you break my law, if you rebel against me. She says all those curses written in the book are going to come upon this place and on its inhabitants, because they have forsaken me, in verse 25, and have burned incense to other gods, that they might provoke me to anger with all the works of their hands. Therefore my wrath will be poured out against this place, and it shall not be quenched. But to the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of Yahweh, thus you shall say to him, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, regarding the words which you have heard, because your heart was soft, and you humbled yourself before God when you heard his words against this place and against its inhabitants, and because you humbled yourself before me, tore your clothes, and wept before me, I truly have heard you, declares Yahweh. Behold, I will gather you to your fathers, and you will be gathered to your grave in peace, so that your eyes will not see all the evil which I will bring on this place and on its inhabitants. So they brought back word to the king. Then the king sent and gathered all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. And the king went up to the house of Yahweh, and all the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the priests and the Levites and all the people, from the greatest to the least. And he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which was found in the house of Yahweh. So he didn't tell some priests to do this. He personally stood up in front of his people and read Deuteronomy, at least, in the hearing of everyone, the greatest and the least, in Jerusalem. Then the king stood in his place and cut a covenant before Yahweh, to walk after Yahweh, and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and with all his soul, to do the words of the covenant that were written in this book. Moreover, he made all who were present in Jerusalem and Benjamin to stand with him. So this wasn't a covenant that's the way that it was phrased, the way it was presented. It wasn't the nation and God. It was him personally and God. And he told everyone else, join me in this covenant that I am making with God. All those who were present in Jerusalem and Benjamin were told to stand with him. So the inhabitants of Jerusalem did according to the covenant of God, the God of their fathers. And Josiah took away all the abominations from all the lands belonging to the sons of Israel, and made all who were present in Israel to serve Yahweh their God. Throughout his lifetime, they did not turn away from following Yahweh, the God of their fathers. And it talks about Josiah celebrating the Passover and his ultimate death in war with Egypt. It was a very unnecessary, very foolish kind of death, but it was what God used to advance his purpose for the nation, that the nation was still facing judgment. It was moving toward judgment, and it couldn't do so as long as Josiah was alive. We have his cleansing of the northern kingdom in more detail in 2 Kings. And this is an interesting connection here. If you can remember this far back to the man of God who came from Judah in the days of Jeroboam, 2 Kings 23. Talking about all of the idols he destroyed. He broke down the sacred, in pieces, the sacred pillars, and cut down the Asherim and filled their places with human bones. And when we get down to verse 15 of 2 Kings 23, verse 15 says, "Furthermore, the altar that it was at Bethel, and the high place which Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin, had made, even that altar and the high place he tore down. And he demolished its stones, ground them to dust, and burned the Asherah." So, very clearly at that point, it wasn't just being used to worship the golden calf. There were other idols there as well. Then Josiah turned, and he saw the graves that were there on the mountain. And he sent and took the bones from the graves, and burned them on the altar, and defiled it, according to the word of Yahweh, which the man of God proclaimed, who proclaimed these things. Then he said, "What is this monument that I see?" And the men of the city told him, "This is the grave of the man of God, who came from Judah and proclaimed these things which you have done against the altar of Bethel." Isn't it amazing that in Bethel they had this altar that remained standing the entire time of the northern kingdom, and at the same time they had a monument to the man of God, a marker on his grave that was noticeable, that caught Josiah's eye, and remembered that he had prophesied destruction against that site. And yet they continued to worship there in willful rebellion to the will of God. And Josiah said in verse 18, "Let him alone, let no one move his bones." So they left his bones undisturbed with the bones of the prophet who came from Samaria. Remember the prophet in Samaria who invited the man of God to his house. He buried the man of God in his own family tomb and requested that he be buried next to him when he died. And also all the houses of the high places which were in the cities of Samaria, which the kings of Israel had made, provoking Yahweh to anger, Josiah removed. And he did to them just as he had done in Bethel. And all the priests of the high places who were there, he slaughtered on the altars and burned human bones on them. Then he returned to Jerusalem. The bell hasn't rung yet. This picture is from Bethel. It's not the high place itself or anything like that. It's a tower nearby, but yeah, this is part of the area of Bethel and the ruins. Okay, let's go ahead and close in prayer. God, thank you for your faithfulness, that even in the midst of the worst societies, the most rebellious societies, you have a people that you can protect and preserve us through anything, that we don't need to fear, that we don't need to groan and shake our heads when we see the world turning away from you. It's always been turning away from you. And help us to do what is right and to lead others to righteousness as well as we can in our own lifetime, and to be content with the work that you've given us to do. Help us to follow the examples of those who have gone before us, to be willing to recognize our own sin and repent when we need to. Even if we're doing well, like Josiah, when we realize there's more that we ought to have been doing, let us legitimately tear our clothes and weep and seek your will, to desire to grow ever more into the kind of people that you want us to be. Thank you so much for your word and the encouragement and the instruction it provides. Help us to continue to study it and follow it and make you the priority in our lives this week. In Jesus' name, amen.